As a young child, going to Blockbuster Video with your parents to rent a video game was a magical experience. All of those shelves of cases to choose from, hundreds and hundreds of titles just waiting to be discovered. Even though it was magical, the whole Blockbuster experience was also a microcosm of childhood in general. Or in other words, it taught you about disappointment and broken dreams. Every little boy is a total mark for video games, a sucker for the empty promises on their colorful back covers. So many flashy titles and screenshots caught my eye in the store, but then ended in sheer disappointment once I got home and actually booted the games up. There were so many culprits of false advertising. In a way, going to Blockbuster as a child is a lot like gambling as an adult. Usually, you lose money, you regret your decisions, wish you made some different choices, but occasionally, you'll strike gold and find that hidden gem that keeps you coming back for more, because maybe, just maybe, you'll strike gold again. I'll never forget the day that I rented Saturday Night Slam Masters. I loved pro wrestling and I loved Street Fighter, so this game that promised to be a fusion of the two worlds, it's like it was made for me. When I fired up my Genesis a mere 20 or 30 minutes later, I was in awe of the game's presentation and style. The character designs were everything I had hoped for. Jumbo was a mix of E Honda and the One Man Gang. King Rastaman was like a mix of Blanca and Jimmy Snuka. I had never played a wrestling game that had actual ramp entrances and themes. I remember Jumbo coming out wearing a pimp cane and a hat, and Rasta had a monkey on his shoulder. This game was like some kind of exquisite masterpiece. But then I started actually playing it. At first I mashed buttons, mostly just punches and kicks, which got me through a few matches in the tournament story mode, but it wasn't long before I started getting my ass kicked. I had hit a wall very quickly, and the special moves in the manual were not helpful. I remember putting it on 2-player mode, alone, just so I could figure out the movesets in peace. But no matter what I did with those A, B, and C buttons, I couldn't seem to figure out the signature moves or perform them on a consistent basis. At the time, I don't think I would have phrased it this way, but I was realizing the truth about this game. It was a novelty that you would drop a few quarters into at the arcade, rather than a game you'd want to replay over and over again for your wrestling or fighting game fix. Many years later, I have given Slam Masters another shot, and honestly, I don't think my sentiments have changed very much. Alright, so let's start how we usually do by talking about the best parts of the game, or what I'm going to call the high spots. Let's start with presentation. For fans of Street Fighter and Capcom lore, this game will look very familiar. The opening theme and visuals, the interface, the character selection, the international stages, and the game modes closely parallel the famous fighting game franchise. Slam Masters even has those post-match text boxes of trash talk between the two fighters, which is ripped directly from the pastiche of Street Fighter. It also features Mike Haggar, who is made famous from Capcom's Final Fight series. Yes, Slam Masters is highly derivative, but that's not really a bad thing in this case. It gives the gamer a baseline reference to go off of, and the tournament fighter framework and gimmicky characters are very well suited for the world of pro wrestling. It's also really hard to complain about the graphics in the game. I mean, good God, the character sprites look amazing, especially for the time period. Slam Masters is basically the result of taking the Street Fighter character designs and putting them in a final fight stage that's reduced to the size of a wrestling ring. I hope that made sense. Even the crowd in the game looks great, much better than the crowds I've seen in other wrestling games of the era. If you look closely enough, there's even a hidden Street Fighter character watching from the audience. You also get wrestler entrances, as mentioned before, something non-existent until many years later. So it's safe to say that Slam Masters was ahead of its time in terms of presentation. Other than the limitations in the game's hardware, I would also say the game sounds great. It's maybe a bit tinny sounding like some other games on the Genesis, so I might have had a slight disadvantage compared to the Super Nintendo version of the game. Either way, you gotta love the classic sound bites that are thrown in from the Street Fighter series. You get the you win, you lose, perfect, round 1, round 2, etc. You also get those garbly, agonized screams from your opponent when you lay the final smackdown upon them. In short, Slam Masters looks and sounds great. If I were wandering around in an arcade as a kid, it would pull me in immediately. Kudos to Capcom. Like a lot of other games I've been reviewing lately, Slam Masters is a true winner in terms of its flavor, world building, and humor. I did some research on the Street Fighter fandom wiki page to find out more about the backstory and characters of Slam Masters. In the Slam Masters universe, professional wrestling had experienced a sudden increase in popularity during the 1980s, where many professional wrestling organizations started popping up all over the world. In order to resolve the conflict between the many organizations, 8 of the federations combined to form the Capcom Professional Wrestling Association, or the CPWA, which was led by Victor Ortega, the federation's first champion. Based on his appearance and his in-ring posing, it's likely that Ortega is based off of superstar Billy Graham and Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Ortega suddenly vanished. He was considered to be the axis of the sport, and his unexpected disappearance caused the CPWA to enter into an age of confusion and disorder. In response, the Blood Professional Wrestling Association, or the BPWA, a dark underground wrestling federation, chose to take advantage of this opportunity, and it began moving in on the CPWA's territory. The CPWA chief executives decided to hold a world tour called the Crash Carnival in order to decide the new king of the CPWA. In the game, after the tournament that you win as the player, Ortega shows up unexpectedly and challenges the winner of the Crash Carnival in order to decide once and for all who is truly and undoubtedly the undisputed leader of the CPWA. Alright, so let's talk about the cast of characters that you have available to you in this game. 10 different grapplers have been recruited for this Crash Carnival tournament, and I'd say that they're reasonably balanced, with character models that fit different wrestling conventions like the masked luchador, the giant, the bodybuilder, the babyface, the monster heel, the technical grappler, etc. It's all very sensationalized, perfectly over the top, and super carny. It wouldn't have surprised me at all to see some of these gimmicks on the card for a WWF Superstars episode, circa maybe 94, 95, somewhere during the new generation. The first character to be aware of is Alexander the Greater, spelled like cheese grater. He's also known as Sheep the Royal in the Japanese version of the game. In terms of his backstory, he's an Australian who was a member of the national rugby team there. When he came to America and participated in football instead, he gained fame and notoriety for his violent behavior, which also eventually got him kicked out of the NFL. So afterwards, naturally, he decided to take up wrestling. His name is obviously a wordplay on Alexander the Great, but he's modeled after the late professional wrestler Big Van Vader. His Japanese name, Sheep the Royal, may be a nod to the sheep herders, the original gimmick of Butch Miller and Luke Williams, who are better known to most American wrestling fans as the Bushwhackers. The next character on the list is Biff Slamkovich, also known as Alexei Zalazov in the Japanese version. He's the main protagonist of the Slam Masters series. He's the son of a Russian senior bureaucrat who received special education in wrestling ever since he was a young boy. He practices an assortment of martial arts, and he strongly dislikes flashy showmanship. It also upsets Biff greatly that some individuals consider wrestling to be fake. At one time, he was a student in Mike Hagar's gym, along with his friend, rival, and fellow wrestler Gunlock, who he is a tag team member with on the team the Hyper Cannons. Biff's quote after losing a match alludes to the possibility that he was once a training partner and friend of Zangief from the Street Fighter series. It's possible that due to their similarities, Biff may have been based and inspired by the late wrestler Nikolai Volkov. Next on the list is El Stingray, also known as El Stinger in Japan. He was apparently trained by a wrestler named Meteorito Jr. He's a high-flying and charismatic masked luchador whose speed is unparalleled by anyone else in the organization. El Stingray is believed to be based on and inspired by the late Mexican luchador Blue Demon. He is also very similar to El Volador or the Flyer, another small Mexican luchador wrestler. His nickname appears to be a shout-out to the retired and popular WCW, TNA, and WWE wrestling star, the man called Sting. The mask and costume he wears in the ring are also similar to the appearance of the Blue Blazer, a masked wrestling gimmick that was made famous by the late Owen Hart. However, overall, he seems to most closely resemble the late luchador Lizmark, due to their very close similarities in the colors and design of their outfits. Next on the list is the Great Oni, El Stingray's biggest rival, and also one of my personal favorite characters in the game. The Great Oni is also known as the Mysterious Budo in Japan. He goes by the moniker the Demon of Sobriety. He's a Japanese wrestler whose theatrical kabuki appearance excites any audience that he's in front of. He has been called the Pale-Faced Devil because of his famous white face paint. He's a good friend to King Rastaman, and the two of them work together as a tag team known as the Exotic Warriors. The Great Oni's character is loosely based on and inspired by two real-life and famous legendary Japanese wrestlers, the Great Muta and the Great Kabuki. Next on the list is Gunlock, who is nicknamed the Florida Wild Horse. Gunlock grew up as a street fighter in the slums and later trained under Mike Hagar along with his friend Biff Slamkovich. At one point, Gunlock tried to put the moves on Hagar's daughter, Jessica, leading to a fight between Hagar and himself. Gunlock's Slam Master's biography states that he is rumored to be related to a famous street fighter, which is largely hinted to be Guile from the Street Fighter series due to their very similar fighting techniques and appearances. Unlike the other characters in the Slam Masters series, it's uncertain exactly what wrestler Gunlock is actually inspired by, although he does share some similarities to the real-life retired wrestler Lex Luger. Next on the list is the big fat man himself, Jumbo Flapjack. Jumbo is a lover of liquor who formerly worked as a bouncer at a dive bar, but he was fired after beating up a customer too severely. Afterwards, he took a job as a wrestler's bodyguard. However, a fight broke out between Jumbo and the wrestler for unknown reasons, eventually resulting in Jumbo knocking him out. He gladly replaced his wrestler subsequently and made his Blood Wrestling Association debut. Jumbo shows absolute obedience to the Scorpion and serves as his loyal right-hand man and tag team partner as part of the team The Silent Assassins. Jumbo's appearance in the series is based on the late wrestler Earthquake or John Tenta, but his jagged face paint, large girth, and fire breathing also resemble the late wrestler Mr. Pogo, who was a hardcore heel from the early 90s. Next on the list is King Rastaman, also known as Missing IQ Gomez in Japan. King Rastaman lived peacefully in the mountains of the Dominican Republic until he was discovered and his athletic ability was evaluated. He then trained under a martial arts master and later debuted as a wrestler. Rasta is usually a tranquil dude, but when he enters the ring, his instincts take over and he goes completely wild. Rasta has an unusually intelligent simian companion named Freak, who arranges all of his matches. Rastaman's design is very reminiscent of the late wrestler Bruiser Brody. It's also believed that Rastaman's design was one of the early character models for Blanca in the Street Fighter series. I would also say that he bears some similarities in terms of his background and personality to the late wrestler George the Animal Steel. Freak the Monkey is Rasta's little companion. Apparently, they grew up together in the jungles of Santo Domingo, and it's said that they have a brotherly bond. Freak's role appears to be both assistant and manager, seeing as how he helps organize and occasionally partakes in Rasta's matches. The fact that Freak is a wrestling monkey might be an homage to the late wrestler and commentator Gorilla Monsoon. Next on the list of characters is Mike Hagar, who made his debut in the original Final Fight series that was released in the arcades in 1989. He is described as a former street fighter and pro wrestler turned mayor of Metro City. Hagar seems to be loosely based after Macho Man Randy Savage. In Slam Masters, his moniker is Mike Macho Hagar, and the game features a winning pose in which he lifts his daughter Jessica onto his shoulders, a possible nod to Savage and his late valet, Miss Elizabeth. Hagar switches his career from wrestler to politician sometime between Slam Masters 2 and Final Fight. In a similar vein, Jesse Ventura would go on to be governor of Minnesota from 1999 to 2003, years after retiring from wrestling. So in a way, Mike Hagar might be a Macho Man Randy Savage, Jesse the Body Ventura hybrid. Next on the list is the Scorpion, who's only playable in the Genesis version. He is simply known as Astro in Japan. The Scorpion was designed by the famous manga artist Tetsuo Hara. His moveset is based on the legendary Japanese wrestler Tiger Mask, but his American name and his mask itself are a subtle reference to the infamous Black Scorpion gimmick in WCW. The Scorpion is a powerful and skilled masked wrestler whose true identity and personal history are shrouded in darkness. He's the leader of the dark professional wrestling organization known as the Blood Wrestling Association, BWA, and he's the main antagonist of the Slam Masters series overall. The last playable character on the list is the iconic Titanic Tim, also known as Titan the Great in Japan. Apparently, he weighed over 5 kilograms at birth, and by the time he graduated from elementary school, he was already over 6 foot 3 inches. According to his bio, he hates small people, and apparently he's also typically mistaken for a disco reject. He's also a good friend of fellow wrestler El Stingray, and the two of them often work together in a team known as the Deadly Brothers. Victor Ortega is Tim's childhood idol, and Ortega is actually the one who inspired and motivated Tim to pursue and take up a career in pro wrestling. It's quite possible that Titanic Tim is inspired by huge wrestlers of the past, such as Giant Baba and the late Giant Gonzalez. Obviously, all the lore, history, allusions, and references in this game are a true rabbit hole for any wrestling nerd like myself. Wrestling is a world of conventions and reiterations on the same themes, all while giving new personal twists and spins to these old tropes. I love how this game is an homage that old fans can appreciate, while still finding a way to be fresh in its own era. Alright, enough of the high spots. Let's talk about the not so great parts of the game, or what I call the botches. Let's start with the controls. Now, don't get me wrong, I would say that Capcom rarely puts out a total clunker. And overall, Slam Masters controls are way better than many wrestling games of the 16-bit console era. But for me personally, the controls aren't deep or versatile enough. Maybe I just kinda suck at the game, but it feels like it's too hard to play. This is much less of a problem when you're playing 1v1 with a friend, since you're both working under the same constraints. But when I was playing tournament mode against the computer AI, I often had to resort to button mashing to win most of my matches, which makes for a pretty repetitive experience with very diminishing returns. Unlike WWF Raw on the Genesis, where using the 6-button controller makes the game way easier to play, that advantage doesn't help you here. Slam Masters is an arcade port with 3 commands: attack, jump, and pin, or A, B, and C in this case. I have a feeling it'd be a lot easier to pull off the moves with an 8-way lever joystick as opposed to my Genesis D-pad. I've never played this game in the arcade before, but I imagine it's a much more fluid experience. I think the problems with the controls come down to 2 things, and it has to do with grappling and running. One of the big issues is that the button you push to grab or grapple your opponent is also the general attack command, or strike command. So really the only difference between punching or kicking your opponent or grappling them is how close you are to them when you perform the command. This is very inconsistent, and it makes it very hard to plan what you're going to do several moves in advance. There's many things you can do once you grapple your opponent. You can hit up and attack to do a variable throw that depends on the different characters. You can hit down and attack that usually does a suplex or a submission hold. You can Irish whip your opponent, etc. But overall, I found it very hard to determine when I was being grappled versus when I was doing the grappling. I also found it very hard to be calculated in what I actually wanted to do in the ring. And I think that ability to be able to visualize your moves and what you're going to do in advance, that's really the sign of a good wrestling game and a good control engine. It's really inexcusable for attack and grapple to be the same command. You don't need to make the C button exclusive to pinning your opponent, since that always happens when they're on the ground, which could then be reserved for A or B instead. I really think running is another important mechanic to get correctly in wrestling games, and the way you do it in Slam Masters is just too tricky and inconsistent. In order to run in the game, you're supposed to quickly tap the left or right button on the D-pad twice in succession, and that causes your character to go into a dash. Once you're dashing, you're able to do clotheslines, drop kicks, all kinds of jumping attacks. But it would have been so much better and easier if you could just hold down A, B, or C while pushing the D-pad to go into a permanent running state. There are some really cool parts about the controls as well. One of the cool things is that when you're on the top rope, you can either taunt your opponent or jump off and perform an attack. I also like that when you find weapons on the outside of the ring, you can jump and hit attack to throw them into the ring. But all of these things are very emblematic of the all-sizzle, no-stake problem that the game has. Even the controls seem more dedicated to the flavor than to the craft of actually making a great wrestling simulation. Through trial and error, I was able to get some of the special moves to work, but there were also other ones that no matter what I did, I just couldn't pull off. It was frustrating to say the least. But this is coming from a guy who couldn't really pull off moves consistently with Ryu or Sagat or various characters in Street Fighter. So like I said, I might just kind of suck at the game. But overall, I would have appreciated one standard command that performs all the different wrestlers' special attacks. That way, I don't need to memorize long move combinations just to pull off something that I've already seen in Street Fighter. I mean, literally, one of the characters does the Psycho Crusher like M. Bison. How derivative can you get? Other than the game's shoddy control scheme, I would also say that a major botch is its very little replay value. Once I ran through the different characters, tried all the special moves, and beat the tournament mode, I didn't feel much urge to fire the game back up. Yes, the deathmatch option is a funny novelty, but it's pretty lame that you can only do it against a human opponent. You're saying I have to have friends to play this game? How dare you? The weapons feel straight out of Final Fight, and the shelf life of the deathmatch overall lasts about as long as the normal game does. Also, it seems highly questionable that you can just slide in and out of those barbed wire ropes, especially when they seem to explode when you hit them on an Irish whip. What gives? Since I'm playing on the Genesis version, I didn't have access to the Team Battle Royal mode, but for good measure, I fired up my emulator and tried out the port that's on the SNES. The Super Nintendo version is fine, but it doesn't change my feelings about the game's mechanics, which are really the central problem. I understand the desire on their part to differentiate between the two ports of the game, especially when the SNES and the Genesis were at each other's throats. But each version of the game would have felt way more complete if they had both the deathmatch and the Team Battle Royal modes. I suppose I lucked out in terms of the playable characters that are available to me on the Genesis, but again, why not just have the full roster available on both games? I can admit that the SNES version plays better, looks better, and sounds better, but these differences aren't great enough for me to consider the two games as separate entities to evaluate. I've heard critiques that say Slam Masters relies too much on fighting game elements while sidelining the wrestling aspect, and I would say that that's a fair piece of criticism. I guess it all depends on what you're looking for. It's great that this game expands beyond the scope of traditional wrestling, allowing non-fans to be ingratiated into our sacred world, but it feels way too much like Final Fight or Street Fighter when it should probably feel something more like Royal Rumble on the Super Nintendo. In a way, Slam Masters feels a lot like a short-term wrestling gimmick, a spectacle that's thrown together to grab attention but quickly reveals itself as being rather half-baked. I would say a good comparison would be with Def Jam Vendetta. Both games are spins on traditional wrestling that excel in their flavor, but the difference is that Def Jam Vendetta also delivers the intricate wrestling mechanics that can satisfy the hardcore fans as well. If you look at Slam Masters pessimistically, you could say that it's two half measures combined into a single game which doesn't feel whole. It's not better than any of the best wrestling games at the time, and it's not better than any of the best fighting games at the time. Basically, it's an acceptable version of both that gets by on its flavor and novelty. As a final grade, I think it's fair to give Slam Masters a 6 out of 10, or the wrestling equivalent of 3 stars. I got a used copy of Slam Masters for the Genesis for $25 on Amazon. If you're intrigued, don't hesitate to give this game a shot, but don't rely on it to be a practical choice that will grant you any kind of longevity. I'm somewhat intrigued by the sequel, which was only released in Japan. I do have access to it through my emulator, so maybe one day I'll open up that toy chest. In the comments below, let me know if you've ever played Saturday Night Slam Masters before. Do you think the matches really only happen on Saturday nights? Do you think it's truly that hard to play, or do you think that I just suck at it? If you liked my review of Saturday Night Slam Masters, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends, and hit that subscribe button. I love making the videos, and I'd appreciate it if you could share it with the world. Don't fret, I'm not done with my pixelated wrestling vision quest just yet. I'll be back soon to review more grappling titles from the 16-bit era. Stay tuned. This is Frankincensed, and thanks for watching.